Good day, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our summer webinar called Growing Roses in Northern Ontario. We're especially glad if you're new to growing roses because we have all the information you need to get started buying, growing, and caring for roses in Northern Ontario and other cold climates. We apologize for the previous failed live webinar on roses. Due to technical difficulties and a slowed internet speed, we decided to cancel the live version and host this one as a recording. You can still ask questions via our Facebook pages. This webinar is brought to you by the Cochrane District Master Gardeners under the Master Gardeners of Ontario Incorporated. You can find the Master Gardeners of Ontario at the internet address mgoi.ca, where you will find gardening resources and a list of the Master Gardener groups in Ontario. And if you have a question about gardening, you can contact your local Master Gardener group and they will be happy to answer all your questions. My name is Pamela Dallaire, and I am the coordinator of the Cochrane District Master Gardeners. It covers the whole of northeastern Ontario area from Timmins north. As for my own interest in rose growing, I have always loved roses, but have only become interested in learning more about them and growing different varieties in the last 3 years or so. Preparing this webinar has taught me a lot about growing roses, and I hope that I can help you learn to grow roses that will flourish in your own yard. With me today is my co-host, Karen Sciuk, from the Kitchener Master Gardeners. Karen, thank you for joining us. Can you tell me a little about your gardening background and the Kitchener Master Gardener Group?
Yes, certainly. Now, this picture of me actually is in my old house in the Oshawa area when I used to belong to the Durham Master Gardeners, and I was the coordinator there for a while. So I've been a Master Gardener since 2009. It's something that I had always wanted to do. From an early age, I was inspired by the men in my life, my great uncles and my grandfathers and my father, who tended to be the more visible gardeners, although the women in my life also gardened. But I used to spend a lot of time out with my uncles and my grandfathers learning about grafting and weeding and searching for bugs. Anyway, a couple years ago, not quite 2 years ago, my husband and I moved to the Waterloo area. So I was fortunate to join up with the Kitchener Master Gardener Group. Now, they are one of the older Master Gardener groups in Ontario, and we do have a few members that have been around for 20 years and one even 30 years.
Wow.
Yeah, and then we also have some new ones. And what we're finding is some of the newer members are younger. So there seems to be a surge in younger people finally joining the horticultural societies and seeking out the Master Gardener groups. I think as more and more people are getting interested in food gardening. And roses, now I got interested in roses. I haven't had much luck growing them in my own garden. That garden you can see there backed onto a ravine, and so I had a lot of rabbits that got into my garden, and they loved to eat any roses I tried to grow. But I did work at a garden center in the Oshawa area for a long time, and we used to buy and bare root roses, many of the hardy roses we're going to talk about today, and we would plant them up. So, you know, I was giving advice to customers quite often about planting and fertilizing and pruning, that kind of thing. So that's about it.
Great. That's a great explanation. I'm glad you had a long history of gardening. I didn't. My grandfather was a gardener just in flowers, but he didn't really do any gardening. So I had to learn from all my mistakes, and I'm glad I did find the Master Gardeners of Ontario, which was just 3 years ago. I didn't even know about them. I guess living in Northern Ontario, we didn't have any group up in this area. So I'm glad that I found them, and I'm hoping we can spread the message that there is a Master Gardeners of Ontario, and you can join if you love gardening. So we'll discuss that at the end of the webinar, but we're on to our webinar. So I'd like to mention that some of the information in this webinar has been adapted from the Durham Master Gardeners presentation on roses, and I'd like to thank them for sharing it with us. So let's get started with our presentation. What is a rose? A rose is a woody perennial of the genus Rosa and in the family Rosaceae. Roses are grown for their wonderful blooms and their fragrance. Not only is there a wide variety of bloom colors and shapes, but there is a difference in the fragrance of roses. As a general rule, darker colored roses are more fragrant than light colored roses. The great thing about roses is that they can survive in almost all garden soils, but I'm not talking about construction soils, soils you would find in a well cared for garden. And there is a rose for every garden as long as there is sunshine. Roses can be self-supporting shrubs, climbing or rambling, and miniature roses can be grown in pots. Flowers range from white to yellows and reds and combinations of all those colors. The one color you won't find in roses is blue, unless it is a violet red colored rose. Rose plants range in size from compact miniature roses to climbers that can reach meters in height. Wikipedia explains that there is no single system of classification for garden roses. However, roses are placed into one of three main groups. Wild roses, which is also called species roses, old garden roses, referred to as OGR in the industry, and modern roses. Besides these categories, growth habit and floral form are also used as means of classification. In the YouTube description below this video, you will find a link to the Compendium of Popular Roses by FTD. And these are broken down under modern, old garden, and species roses. They even help you identify that mystery rose in your own garden. The latter two groups are usually subdivided further according to hybrid lineage, although due to the complex ancestry of most rose hybrids, such distinctions can be imprecise. Growth habits and floral form are also used as a means of classification. Wild roses either have a single bloom that has a flat shape with the petals generally flaring out and consists of up to 7 petals per bloom, or a double bloom, 15 petals in 2 rows. The rose shown is Rosa virginiana that does well in zone 2, which I'm in, and grows into a thick waist-high spreading ground cover. Old roses have round blooms with masses of even petals. These are roses in existence before the year 1867. These are grafted onto hardy rootstock that will withstand colder winters, hotter summers, and wetter or drier areas than the original plant root. Some types are Gallica, Damask, Centifolia, Moss, Portland, and China, or Rosa chinensis. Large, graceful shrubs and usually put on a spectacular but once only display of bloom in summer. But in a short summer, this is less of a concern, as a short flowering period may last 1/3 of our summer. The flowers come in many forms and are usually in the white to pink to crimson spectrum and richly fragrant. This one is Charles de Mille rose, which grows in Zone 4, and it's available by mail order from Cornhill Nursery as a bare root rose and from your local rose suppliers in pots. The petal count is very double. Modern garden roses have been bred from the older roses, and so classification can be confusing, but they are more likely to repeat flowering. Some of the common modern roses are hybrid teas, floribundas, grandifloras, and polyanthas. Shrub roses come in a variety of sizes and hardiness, but most have good disease resistance and pest resistance. They grow larger, and the bush requires less pruning than the delicate tea roses. Included in this category are English roses created by the English rose hybridizer, David Austin. Climbing and rambling roses can be trained to cover the sides of buildings, trellises, and arbors, or ramble along the ground, effectively creating a ground cover. Miniature roses are the tiny versions of the larger rose and grow from 8 to 24 inches. How can we use roses in our garden? We've all seen pictures of beautiful rose gardens, or you may have even visited one, but these gardens are cared for by garden staff that spend hours tending to all the needs of each rose. This isn't the type of garden you want for your yard. In your own garden, you should strive for a mixed border that combines roses, perennials, shrubs, and additional plants that require the same conditions as roses, namely rich soil and full sun. Roses as decorative accents in your garden and locate them where you can see and enjoy their fragrance.
Yeah, one thing that
Karen, can you explain? Yeah, I was just going to say, can you explain to people why they need to have a mixed border?
Yeah, so that's what I'm going to suggest. Like a mixed border sort of mimics nature more closely. It's important to have layers. And so in the layers, you know, with the shrubs, taller shrubs and trees, hedges, you're going to provide some of the wind protection for roses that they need over the winter. The other thing is that if it's mixed, you're less likely going to spread rose-specific diseases and pests that can easily jump from one rose plant to another. For example, mildews, aphids, there's, you know, hundreds of different aphids, and rose aphids only go on roses. Um, you know, there's yellow, black, red aphids. So people worry that if they've got one plant infected with an aphid, that it's going to infect the neighbor. Well, if it's not the same related species, that's usually not going to happen. And so some of the other pests that we're going to discuss later, like sawflies, there's many sawfly types that infect different plants. So if you have a mixed border, you're also going to be encouraging some of the natural predators. You're providing habitat for the birds that would peck away at some of the grubs. And so you're just going to promote a healthier environment if you have a mixed border.
Yes, and a lot of people don't realize that birds are one of our best pest collectors. They're everywhere on my garden this year. They're just picking up everything, and it's funny that way that people don't even think that to attract birds to help their gardens.
Yeah, so that's why it's really important to have the shelter where the birds feel safe from predators, and they're more likely then to sort of scan your prized rose for little critters that we don't want there.
Yes. So roses can cover an archway or hide an ugly shed with climbing or rambling roses. And you should surround yourself by scent by placing roses into one of the mixed beds you're creating near your sitting area. Put a bench there. Don't just want else to see, because and they're so beautiful. That's what you're planting them for, to see and to smell. So get up close. Put a rose into a bed in sun, and put a seat there for yourself and have your morning coffee with it, or evening coffee if you want, because they do smell better. Have you found they smell better in a warmer temperature?
Yeah, I think the perfume particles sort of hang in a humid air better, perhaps.
Yes,
Yeah.
warm, humid air.
Yeah.
I wish we had more warm air up here, but this year has been bad. So, but yes, a lot of people live in warm climates. And if you notice on the screen, it's beside a wall. The stone would give off more heat and help increase the fragrance.
Yes, yeah.
And you can put them near a window of your house. If you've got cold temperatures like I do, put them where you can see them, and as long as there's sun.
Yeah, I think that's the design element that people often neglect when they're planning their gardens, is not only do you want to look at the views from where you walk about or sit outside, you also want to critique it from which windows you enjoy it from. Yeah.
Yes, I always try and put my best part of my garden right in front of my bay window at the front, so that it doesn't matter what the temperature is, I can enjoy the flowers. So you can put a rose bed along a fence line. And if you don't even have a yard, you can put miniature roses in pots and place them close to your door every time you step outside. But they do need to be outside. Don't be putting them in your house, because there just isn't enough sun for roses inside.
Yeah, they definitely are a minimum of 6 hours kind of plant.
Yes, and this year we haven't even had 6 hours a day of sun, but my roses are doing fine. So as long as they're outside.
Yes.
So in this webinar, we can't cover all the types of roses, but I can see everyone's already excited and eager to go out and buy roses to plant this fall. But wait, you need to do some research first. Don't rush off to your local box store and pick up a rose just because you like the look of a bloom. There are some considerations to look at when choosing roses for your garden. The first is sunlight. Do you have an area in your garden that has 6 to 8 hours of sunlight every day? Roses need full sun and prefer morning to mid-afternoon light, as opposed to afternoon to late evening sunlight. Can you explain that, Karen?
Sorry, I was a bit distracted. My dog was
Yeah,
barking in the background.
no, we're just talking about the difference between the sun heat in the late afternoon compared to this cool sun in the morning, that roses prefer cool sun rather than the
Yeah, well, if you
heat
think
of the
about
sun.
afternoon sun, you really want very drought tolerant plants that are in an afternoon sun exposure. So you've got to think about how petals and leaves breathe. So they're going to, think of how lush petals are. They want to preserve the moisture. So when it's really hot, they're going to be opening up their pores and losing a lot of that moisture. So things will wilt, the color will fade. So often morning sun is better.
And
But
roses do have a lot of leaves compared to
yes,
blooms. So it's not like you're looking at other things like mums from the store where there's lots of blooms and very little leaves. They have a lot of foliage, and you want to protect the humidity in not in the foliage, but in the plant itself. So if you have a choice to grow your roses in the afternoon sun or the morning sun, a lot of us don't have that choice, do it in the morning sun.
Yeah, often and also with the afternoon sun, especially as the weather gets colder, is when plants suffer from sun scald, which is a damage that we don't think of. Like, for example, in the winter, the canes, if they're not buried under some kind of mulch or burlap, the extremes of temperature on a hot, sunny winter day
In the
relative to
afternoon.
relative to the freezing cold at night, the contrast causes sort of a freeze thaw and an opening of the pores, so plants get desiccated. So that's another reason that morning sun is better than afternoon sun.
That's a good explanation. I hadn't even thought of that, but yes, you do see the same effect in trees
Yes.
when they have bare stems, trunks, and the winter sun gets to it and heats them up, and then they split because then
Yes.
at night they freeze solid.
Yeah, so the same sort of theory happens to the rose canes that if you're trying to encourage a larger shrub, you don't want those canes to die back. Yeah.
Thank you. Roses are nature's sunbathers. They love the sun, and so you'll need a place where they can bask in it. If you aren't sure how many hours of sun your garden gets, take a backyard vacation right now and sit outside with a book while watching how the sun slants across your garden. Make notes on what areas receive sun and shade at different times of the day. If you don't write it down, believe me, you'll forget. So if you're going to take a day where you're doing some cooking and you're home, go out every half hour, see where the sun and the shade is, take a little notebook and make some notes, and then every time you go to the store to buy a plant, you'll know how many hours of sun you have.
Yeah, and the other thing is that sometimes, in your particular garden, you might have 3 hours of early morning sun and 3 hours of late afternoon sun and be shaded because of where fences and trees are. So that still
Yes.
is quite a lot of sunshine, but it's at the different ends of the day.
And it's important to do it at this time of year in the late summer when all your other plants are at their full height, because I have some plants that are 8 feet tall and they grow that in one season and die back every year. If I did it next spring, those plants wouldn't be there.
Yeah,
And
so
I wouldn't know how much shade they give.
that's an important aspect. It's also, the converse to that is that it allows you to grow shade loving plants in a sunny spot if they're shaded by a fast growing shrub or a perennial that gets tall in the summer.
Yes. Yes, that's exactly what I have. I have my shade-loving plant. This is the first one that comes out, the Palmaria, in the spring. It's the first plant for bees, and then these other tall delphiniums and Rudbeckia Golden Glow start growing and just shade it for the rest of the summer, and it has no problem.
Yeah.
What about the winter? You may be surprised to know that roses love snow, especially deep snow. Snow insulates the ground, preventing freeze and thaw cycles that will kill your plants. What we have here, and that's why we can grow roses up here in zone 2, even though it gets to 40 below in the wintertime, but the ground stays frozen as long as we have hardy stock for the temperature of the ground. They're covered in 3 all winter long.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of customers of my past customers, if they live slightly north of the GTA, which is where I was located, and now even in the Kitchener area, because we've had a lot of winters where there seems to be a confusion between the spring and the winter. So you've got a mock spring, everything thaws, things come out of dormancy, and then it gets cold. And because there hasn't been often good snow cover, a lot of plants like roses are very vulnerable to coming out too early, whereas up north, they're probably safer.
They don't come out until the end of May.
Yeah.
We have a short season, but we have so many plants that will, so many roses that will survive up here. And I was just blown away just in the last couple of years, just doing the research of how, I thought, okay, we're going to have 10, 20 varieties of roses that we can grow up here. And it turns out there's 95 varieties from one company that will grow up here. And so hopefully I'm planning a rose garden in our town, and that will just take some time. But we want to really showcase how many roses that we can grow up here. I'm sure people have no idea.
Exactly. Yeah. That's wonderful.
Yes. So our next consideration is hardy rootstock that will survive the winters up here. So most people don't know that roses are grafted. That means they put the variety of rose that you want onto the roots of a hardier rose. Rose Society suggests purchase Canadian grown roses. Now, I must say that just yesterday, I was online looking for rose that sell to the big box stores because I wanted to know where they came from. And one of the rose sellers that sells to Canada and like all of North America, they actually grow their roses in California and Arizona.
Yeah, so they're not going to be too hardy up here.
If they're growing them down there and then they ship them up to a big box store and you're going to pick them up, the chances are you're just wasting your money.
Yeah, and I think
So
this is I was going to say this is particularly important when you're buying the hybrid teas, grandifloras, floribundas, which tend to all be grafted. But some of the other series we're going to talk about later are on their own rootstock. So that's really important for people buying roses, if they're not getting the bare root, to kind of scrape the soil away and have a look.
And you have no idea unless they state it on the tag what it is. So like the cheaper ones will not state what it is. So in areas of Canada that experience winter, we prefer the rootstock called Rosa multiflora for winter hardiness. That's just what they use for Canada rootstock. And many people in the northern US order roses from Canada to get this rootstock because the ones they're buying from the States is not. And so if they're in the northern states, survive because the roots will freeze. And if a rose comes from the southern US, you can be assured that it will not be on the rootstock Rosa multiflora. That's why I was concerned when I saw that the big box stores are buying from California and Arizona. They don't need to put it on that rootstock. Now they say to check the label. I don't know if our labels in the big box stores like Canadian Tire state the rootstock.
Probably not. No, they I don't think they do. You'd have to actually check the source.
Yeah, and if you're a Canadian Tire, unless you've got a Wi-Fi signal or you're going to use your cell phone, you can't check that. You don't have time. You don't want to be doing that in the big box store.
No, the other thing I would say though about Canadian Tire is that they tend to be individual stores. So I've seen a wide variety of plant quality between Canadian Tire stores. So ones where there's sort of a real gardening aficionado who does the ordering, they actually get,
the hardier ones.
Yeah. Whereas some of the other chains, they have a central buyer that buys for all of them.
Home Depot has a central buyer, and even though, yes, I know the one in Timmins does not have a choice. The truck just comes and whatever it is, and she has to sell it. So So if you're looking for something unique, there is one seller, Cornhill Nurseries in New Brunswick, selection of hardy roses, and they're shipped bare root across Canada. We're not trying to plug them, but there are very few sellers in Canada. There are other ones that sell on the Rosa Multiflora, and such as PalantineRoses.com and HorticoNurseries.com, who grow roses that are hardy in Canada. And these websites will be in the YouTube description below the video.
No.
And
The other one, Pam, to interject, I was looking today, so I also found another one called Adamson's Heritage Nursery Limited that's in Langley, BC. So they also provide a lot of these hardy Canadian roses, like the Explorer Parkland Canadian Artist Series.
Yes.
And they tend to only pick roses that are on their own rootstock, so they're not getting the grafted ones. So that's something worth looking into as well.
Yes, and I want to say that anyone listening to this webinar, watching the webinar, can send us a message and say, we know of another one, and I'll add it in the description below because I can edit it at any time. So in the future, if someone out there listening knows of another store that sells, I know there are a lot of local nurseries that will sell, but we're talking about mail order, and because from BC, what are you going to do, drive to BC? I don't think so, just to get your rose, unless you have someone living there. But yeah, mail order places that will ship roses that are hardy in our climates. We're open to anyone to send us those website addresses. And so roses can be purchased as bare root, which are live plants in a dormant state. They're asleep, and they're dormant so they can ship them without them dying. Now, you can also buy them in pots as in nurseries at your local nursery. If you're shipping, though, it's less expensive to buy the bare root roses, obviously, because you're not shipping the soil.
Now, one thing that I wanted to mention about bare root, because this was at least half the roses that we sold at the garden center that I used to work at, we would buy them bare root and get them planted up early. And the important thing to notice about bare root is often the root stalk and then the main central stem is too tall for most pots. And so they would not be planted that deeply in the pot relative to where they should be in the garden. So the old rule of always planting your plant at the same height that they are in the pot doesn't apply. So it's really important to actually look at the structure of where the roots begin versus where the shoots come out, and that is what informs where you plant them. So don't take the pot
and we're going to talk about
granted.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in more detail later in the webinar. But yes, people shouldn't just assume that where they are in the pot is where they're going to plant. The next thing to consider is plant hardiness. And now I've just thrown you for a loop because we were talking about the cold and the rootstock. But now we're talking about the top of the rootstock, the plant hardiness of the type that has been grafted onto the rootstock. Plant hardiness refers to the geographic zones in which specific category of plant life is capable of growing. So yeah, we're cold up here. You'll find a link to this map description below, and I live in zone 2A. So I have to grow the hardiest roses in the world. What zone do you live in, Karen, and what roses do you grow?
Down here in Kitchener, Waterloo area where I live now, and also where I used to live in the Oshawa area, which is just east of Toronto. Both those areas are zone 5, and So that is not quite as warm as, say, some of parts of the Toronto close to the lake, or Niagara on the Lake, which can approach zone 7. So, we're able to grow a lot more of the tender roses, like the hybrid teas. But because of the winters that we've had with sort of freeze thawing of the ground and not enough snow cover, you have to be very careful about the planting depth and what kind of winter protection you use.
Yes, at least you're a lot warmer than I am. And there is a big difference in garden zones. If you live in the center of a city, protected by other houses and surrounded by asphalt, you may be able to overwinter plant varieties that demand one whole zone, I'll get it out here, one whole zone warmer than the surrounding area, like my sister does in Timmins. She has a 10-foot high cedar hedge around her whole garden, and she can grow zone 4 plants, close to her house, and I can't do that.
Yeah, so that's what.
Do you find that in your city?
Oh, definitely. Like, there's always microclimates. So if you're in a new subdivision with no trees and shrubs yet, and people haven't even put up fences yet, then there's a lot more wind exposure. Things are a lot colder. So when you're considering sort of more tender plants, you might want to get your major trees and hardier shrubs in first, your fences up, and then you start to plant things that need to have more protected. So you create microclimates. So that's something really important to consider in the succession of your garden. Yeah.
Yes, I'm in zone 2 here, and I'm in the rural end of town. I'm actually not in town. So, and my garden gets both north and south winter wind, and I have no protection. So I have to rely on our heavy snow cover. And even if that means shoveling snow on top of them in the beginning of the winter, that's what I usually do. And I grow them close to my house. And I've found even with the trees in the area, people plant trees and they say they're hardy to zone 2 if they plant them on the north or south side of their house, because we have north wind all winter.
Yeah, it's probably the zone 1 there.
They will survive if they're on the north or south side, but they won't survive if they're on the east or west side, which receives all the wind all winter. The house is blocking the wind, and so line where the houses across the street and your house will block the wind, they'll survive, but they won't survive where the driveways are.
No, that's actually a good point. And what I found where I live here is I live in a small rural town in the middle of huge farmland fields where the wind really blows hard. So what I've noticed in my little neighborhood here is a lot of people with established gardens have made these wooden huts, sort of teepee or sort of, anyway, they put them over some of their more wind vulnerable plants in the winter because the wind really rips here because there's not a lot of protection. So I thought that's because I didn't see that in Oshawa where I used to live, but out here it's very exposed to cold winds.
And every garden is different. Every garden is different. You have to look at your own. So disease resistance is one of the most important criteria that rose growers look for in new varieties. Of 100% disease or pest-free roses, but reducing the amount of damage to your rose before you purchase a variety. And due to the pesticide ban in Ontario, I recommend a mixed border rather than a monoculture of roses to inhibit the spread of rose disease or pest. And you can look for disease resistance on a rose tag on the plant or in a catalog. If you see that it says disease resistance over a variety that does not say that, choose the one that says disease resistant, even if you like the one that is prone to disease, excuse me, better. Because you're just going to have trouble from day one. If you can get a disease-resistant variety, get that one instead. Don't you agree, Karen?
Definitely, and usually this is talking about the fungal diseases like black spot or the downy mildews. And unfortunately, those, because roses are popular, those particular diseases, the ones that are varieties that are specific to roses, are the spores are floating around in the atmosphere, in the soils, and so they're out there waiting. So if you get the disease-resistant one, you're better off.
And they don't always show up on the plant in the store. They've been protected in greenhouses and sprayed, and so
yes, because they're allowed to use fungicides that we, the homeowner, are not allowed to use. Yes.
Yes. And a lot of people don't understand that we can't use what the big growers are using as sprays, and so they have been sprayed before they come to our house. But once they're at our house, we're stuck with the problem that's come with the plant or that will attack the plant.
Yes. Well, the other thing to consider too is the soil that's used when they're planted in a greenhouse is new, sterilized, often soil, whereas in your garden, it's been sitting there collecting wind-blown things for a long time.
Yes. So how do you know if the rose you want to buy is disease resistant? So hopefully the tag will show that, the one that's attached to the plant, but that doesn't mean that there will be a tag. Just because a plant's on sale, that's not a reason to buy it, unless you're going to treat it as an annual and let it die. Because if there's no tag, money out the window, because a lot of plants right now are on sale for the year, and in the stores, in the big box stores, and if they don't have a tag to go with it, I wouldn't buy it. It's just, you might as well just throw your money in the garbage can and not even bother going to the store. Don't you agree, Karen?
Yeah, I agree, especially if you want gardening success. Unless you're, unless it's a $2 plant and you're willing to sort of take a chance and not be too upset if it doesn't thrive. The other thing is, if it does at least have a cultivar name tag, then you can look it up, and usually you'll find good information online about things like disease resistance, if you have the time to do that.
The internet is a good thing for doing research on our plants. That's the one thing I can say.
Well, and I think a lot of young people, especially if it has a tag that has one of those, I forget what they're called, but it's a little
it's
symbol.
A little square box that they can just put their phone over and it tells them.
Yeah, so a lot of young people especially are using that in garden centers. And so those are often linked to a lot more extensive information that would tell you the rootstock and the disease resistance.
Yes, because it usually links you back to the original grower.
Yes, yes.
It doesn't mean that you can just put in the name of the rose plant information, because it might be on a different rootstock.
Yes, yes.
So the last criteria we talk about is petal color. And people might say, why is petal color the last thing you think about? Because this seems to go against all our shopping strategies. We love color and we love buying on impulse. But most varieties of yellow won't grow in my climate. I have to choose between the white, pink, cream, and red varieties. But you can guarantee I'll be watching for any new varieties as they become available. The yellow are just more zone 4. They're just not as hardy. And so your own hardiness zone will determine the color varieties available to you. Do you find that there are any colors that you can't grow in your own garden?
I think in zone 5 you can pretty much get all colors, but in general, yellow in roses is a color that is associated with less hardiness, less disease resistance, less pest resistance. So it is a more difficult color to find a successful rose type. Yeah.
And we hope that they'll come up with one soon so we can have yellow roses in our garden. Breeders extend the range of naturally occurring colors in species and wild roses to enrich shades and variations. Gardeners in all northern temperate climates can grow roses with variations in temperature tolerance according to the variety, just like you were speaking about the yellow roses. And now with our newfound knowledge, we can go shopping for roses, but which variety or type will you choose? First of all, which varieties do you associate with those long-stemmed roses you receive or give on Valentine's Day? So those are the hybrid tea roses. They're the most popular ones, which produce one large flower on the end of a long stem.
Yeah, which to me, like, if people are just looking at the flower head itself, they are pretty voluptuous, gorgeous flowers. But as a shrub, I find hybrid teas, once they're in the garden and sort of branching out and becoming a shrub, they're not as attractive as most of the other
they don't
types. Yeah.
foliage underneath, but that's where a mixed border comes in. The blooms are produced all season long, but they are grown for their buds only and do not make nice landscape plants, just as you were saying. They come in a wide variety of colors, fragrant and no fragrance, so you have to check that too. But there's a downside to this type of rose. Unfortunately, these are very tender, which means they die easily over the winter, even in more moderate climates, you were saying, unless they're protected. And they take 4 to 5 years to reach full height. So you won't get that in your first season if you plant them.
Yeah, I know. I must say, in the garden center that I used to work at, we were trying to educate people about the beauty of other types. Hybrid teas, because they're grafted as well, are much more difficult to protect in our variable winters. And as you said, they don't have, a lot of them don't have a nice fragrance either. So,
that's
people don't
why when
realize
people get these beautiful roses for Valentine's Day, go to smell the rose and there's nothing. And they're disappointed. That's why we got to push the old roses. But the problem is, these are the ones that the big box stores, even up here, are trying to sell you. And there is a reason for that too, that they because they're not a nursery, they're just a big box store. They are supplying a need. You want roses, so they will sell you roses. And if they die, worried about the warranty, then you'll go back next year and buy it again.
Yeah.
Not
Well, I think
knowing
that's where
why.
customers could maybe start educating the big box stores and the people the staff. And so the more pressure we put on them, then they might start
And
to
us master gardeners should be pushing.
Stock more of our Canadian bred roses that have been bred to be hardy. That would be a good thing.
Buy local. Tell them, hey, buy local. Yes, that's why they provide the big box stores provide you with plants that already have a bloom on them, because they know you're attracted to that bloom color, the bloom shape, seeing something already in bloom, and you're going to go home with it and put it in your garden, and next spring it's just going to be mush. And that's marketing and making sure you spend money every year in their store.
Yeah.
But for those living farther south, Toronto zones 6 or greater, you can have you can give your hybrid teas a try, along with the Floribunda roses, which are shorter and bushier than tea roses and produce clusters of flowers, but they are not usually And the most notable being the David Austin roses. Everybody wants a David Austin rose. They just hear that name and they think, oh, I gotta grow David Austin roses.
Well, and as you'll see in these pictures, these are some of the favorite ones that you'll find in many places, that there is a lot of yellow varieties available in the Floribunda grouping.
Yes. And the grandiflora roses that produce big, beautiful blooms and pointed buds like the tea roses, but with the hardiness of a Floribunda. And when you go to hardiness, you've got to start looking at those tags, and hopefully you're in a nursery and not the big box store, so they will have that information at a nursery. Polyantha roses, we're getting more north into zone 4, and these are smaller, compact bushes up to 3 feet in height, and they have clusters of smaller blossoms though, but the clusters make up for it. And they're great for containers and front borders. And this Polyantha is a dwarf variety. I'm not sure of the height.
Yeah, they're often only 2 feet high. They tend to be spread wider than they get tall. So they might be like 2 feet high and 3 feet wide, or maybe reach 3 feet high, but get 4 feet wide.
That'd be good for near your front entrance.
Yes. Yeah, this particular fairy is one of the most popular Polyantha varieties. It's been around. I haven't even
checked to. I didn't check to see if it was fragrant or not.
Yeah, I think it is actually. It's fairly fragrant.
And everyone's seen miniature roses in a pot, and if you haven't, it's something you can consider. And miniature roses, because they're so small, they're usually sold already in full growth. You can actually treat them as an annual if you want. But if you want to have them as perennial, they need special care, because new minis come out of the greenhouse and they actually shouldn't even be exposed to full sunlight right away, because they've been grown in a greenhouse and you may burn the foliage. So I suggest, if you get some miniature roses, gradually put them into more and more sun over a 10-day period before putting them in full sun all day long. And if it gets cold at night, bring them inside, and don't put them in your garden because they don't like cold ground, and we have cold ground.
No, also what I find, if you don't have room to put them inside, especially if they're small enough, you can just cover them when you know a cold night is coming with a bucket or something.
Or a garbage can. Put
Yeah.
them in a garbage can.
Mm-hmm.
I use a garbage can for things, an old one. And buy them early in the season so that you have that 10-day window to gradually introduce them to more and more sun. So don't wait until you want to put them out for a special occasion. Go and get them a couple of weeks ahead and keep them warm, and then they'll be ready for your special occasion when you want to put them outside. And needless to say, water, 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 because they're in pots. They need to be watered, and never let them dry out. And to be watered more often than roses that are planted in the ground, obviously, because you just have to treat them as a pot plant and just keep them moist, because otherwise they will dehydrate in the sun and dry out, because you have to keep them in the sun. And wild roses are also referred to as species roses, and they include wild and some direct hybrids created from the original plants. These species roses are very hardy. The ones from Cornhill Nurseries that I have are zone 2 in my zone. And the only thing about species roses is they give a one-time display of blooms. But that's not just one day. That is one, time frame during your summer. But it's well worth it to have a whole plant covered all in one time with roses.
And also, don't these ones often have nice rose hips as well?
Oh, yes. you don't deadhead them, which means taking off the flowers after they've stopped blooming, then you'll have rose hips that turn bright red in the late fall, and they last a lot of the winter on the rose bush. So you have something to look at during the winter too, except mine are under snow. So
Yeah, so that's what I like for this kind of rose is, you know, the first week or so you might pinch back the spent blooms to encourage more. But then at some point when it's getting close to the end of their bloom time, leave the remaining ones on so they form the rose hips. So that you sort of
Yes.
extend the season of interesting plant to look at.
Yes. So up here, we're talking about middle of June to the middle of August, right in the summertime for the bloom period. So it seems extended to us, but down south, that would be a short amount of time. That would be considered a short amount of time. But up here, it's like 1/3 of our summer.
That's right.
Okay, Alba roses are hardy from zone 3B to 4 and are some of the oldest roses. This one is Madame Plantier from Cornhill Nurseries, of course. It grows up to 2 meters. It has an arching foliage, so it doesn't just stand up straight, it arches as it grows. Excuse me. The bloom is very double and it has good fragrance. So they look great even when not in bloom. And Alba roses are unusual because they are somewhat shade tolerant.
Yeah, and I think like you do see a few Alba varieties in the nurseries and garden centers around the GTA, but not too many. And I think, you know, more gardeners should look to the catalog shipping companies to get some of these old roses, because we tend to mostly have access to the hybrids that are grafted onto rootstock. And so I think we need to start getting more of these older varieties that are on their own roots.
Yeah, definitely. And Gallica roses are old European roses. They're a stocky shrub with fine prickles and deep green foliage. And many of them have striped or mottled petals. And they're mainly pink, deep pink, crimson, and purple. And this one's Rosamundi. I mean, a lot of people have heard the name Rosamundi and not known what it looks like. And Gallicas are usually hardy to zone 4. So technically in Timmins, if you're downtown Timmins and have a sheltered garden, and against your house, you might be able to grow a Gallica rose. You might be able to grow Rosamundi. And then there's the Explorer roses. Oh, these are some of my favorite. And the Canadian Artist Series roses. It's a result of the Agriculture Canada breeding programs. And as the name suggests, they are tough roses, ranging in color and hardiness from zone 2 to 4, depending on the rose. And these are considered tender roses here in the north. And so we have to protect them for the winter and cross our fingers that they survive. But I'd like to say that there's nothing wrong with challenging yourself to try and grow a rose that is hardy in one zone warmer than where you live, as long as you're willing to give it some tender loving care and some winter protection.
So, for example, I think there are a few zone 2 roses in the Explorer series, though, I think.
Yes.
But
Yes.
most of all the Canadian artist roses are zone 3.
Yes. Yeah, zone 3 to 4.
Yeah.
So they would definitely need protection up here in my town. But I campfire. It seems like everyone up here wants campfire, and they're just waiting for me to start trying to grow it to see if it'll grow. So, you know, when I show them pictures of our planned rose garden, they say, "Oh, I want campfire." So that's probably going to be one of the roses I test next year in a very sheltered location in my back garden. So
yeah, it is
that should be interesting.
it's a lovely two-tone one, and
It's like fire when it
yeah.
starts out. And rugosa roses. They're the ones that thrive in poor conditions, and they're content even when neglected. They're my favorite. Just leave them alone, let them do their thing. And they're highly disease resistant. And they produce masses of textured single blooms that are highly fragrant, long lasting, and they actually don't react well to fungicides, which can cause the
No.
leaves to yellow and drop.
Yeah, so this is the other thing that I would say is that a lot of garden centers that have overhead sprinkler systems that contain the fertilizer in the water, they don't tend to sell these because their irrigation system
They can't
burns.
change it.
But these are the ones that people see in commercial landscapes, in front of banks and things, because they thrive on neglect.
Yes.
And in mass plantings, they look wonderful. They're easy.
And they smell wonderful.
Yes, and then a lot of people tend to grow them at their cottage, their northern cottages, because they don't need looking after when you've gone for a week or 2 weeks, when you're not visiting there frequently. So
and they'll grow in our heavy soil, which is clay up here. So.
Yeah, they're a fantastic rose.
And Hansa is a rugosa rose, and that's a staple in my garden. I couldn't do without it. This red one, it's just dark pink, excuse me. And the full blooms provide fragrance that fills the air. I have it on the side of my house, and it blooms more if you deadhead the bloom, the spent flowers. But if you leave the blooms, like we discussed, you'll have bright red rose hips in the fall and winter. But it's a big bush, but it can take a beating. Mine froze at snow level last winter, 5 feet this summer, and still growing. It's still blooming. Right now, we've already had 2 frosts last week, and I mean heavy frost. It looked like there was snow on the roof. Excuse me. And it's still blooming.
So it hasn't been dieback.
It had dieback. It didn't even wilt after those frosts.
Yeah, so
there's no damage. There's no damage.
This variety of shrub rose is one that you will find even in the southern areas of Ontario. So it seems to be popular many places. Yeah.
And it smells beautiful. It smells something like cloves.
Yeah, quite spicy.
Rugosa rose is Blanc Double de Coubert, which might be the most famous rugosa rose, and I didn't even know that. It's very fragrant and tough to boot. It's hardy in zone 2, and I guess it's time for me to go shopping.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry to say we can't cover all the varieties available for the north, but that's your homework, browsing all the online and mail order catalogs. That's the fun part. I just got mine out today. But it's time to look at how we can care for the new additions to your garden. We're going to look at planting. The best time to plant roses, most people think of as spring, but late fall is when the weather is cool, and that's when bare root roses are shipped. Excuse me. They actually ship the roses for this area between September and October. And you have to tell them, I need it in September, because in October, the ground is frozen. And you want the plants to have time to put down some roots. They are completely dormant. They're shipped dormant, but they will put down some roots in September. But if you want to plant rose later in the season, don't wait to plant it. Just make sure it's well watered during the heat of the summer, because I think down there you still have summer. We're starting our fall already.
Yeah, like if people are planting late in the season here, it's extending into November, but the same principle applies. People don't realize, because a lot of sort of places where you buy plants have already shut down and not selling anything, but the fall is one of the best times to plant, often deciduous they're dormant up top, so the roots, they're only putting their energy into their roots. They're not struggling to make leaves. And if they don't even get their roots started, they're sort of snugly down there in the snow, in the soil. And as soon as the soil warms up in the spring, they can start growing long before it's safe for us to start digging. So the fall is always, or whenever it is, like up north, obviously, it's early fall.
It's the fall.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Then that's a good time to plant. Excellent time to plant.
Yes. And in the fall, you don't have to worry about rain.
No.
Because we know it rains in the fall.
Well, not even that. At night time, there's the heavy dew. So there's a lot of moisture that is settling on the ground. And so it's an excellent time.
And even frost. Frost will melt during the day and provide a lot of water.
A lot of root production that goes on when leaves are not growing.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yeah, people don't think about that. They're still putting on roots in the fall for next year, for things to grow and bloom next year.
Well, I think what people don't often realize is the plant under the ground, the root zone, is often as large as the plant above the ground. And
yes,
so you got to think about that growth too.
Yes, a good point. Okay, we're talking about planting. So the old rule for planting was to plant a 50-cent plant in a $5 hole, which meant you spend more money on the hole, amending the soil, than on the rows. But the new information more strongly encourages that plants be allowed to adapt to their native soil, that garden, with minimal use of amendments. So we suggest that you do not add amendments such as peat moss or compost directly into the planting hole. But a better method is, if you have bad soil, incorporate organic matter into the whole bed. So make your whole bed better by amending the whole bed before you plant a rose. But if it isn't possible to do that, some organic matter into the soil removed from the hole. So you're mixing some more organic matter into the native soil, which came from the hole, and backfill with that. Or use the native soil, put it back, and top dress the garden bed with compost or other amendments, and then mulch the surface of the soil to retain the moisture. And if you have an interest in the science of gardening and soil, the Garden Professor's blog can be found on Facebook with links to soil amendments and much more. There's science coming out all the time on gardening, and if you're really into gardening, the Garden Professor's blog on Facebook is a really interesting place. It's all about the science of gardening and soil.
Yes, I think there's a renewal of interest in the health of soil. It's a non-renewable resource. And so it's really important to understand sort of the ecosystem down there and the structure of the soil, and not to think that you have to replace what's already there. Use what you got. I do think it's important to replenish organic matter, but as Pam was saying, is just top dress, so you're not destroying the structure underneath.
In my garden, the earthworms will turn everything in themselves.
Yes.
Within a couple of months. I mean, it's gone, and you're saying, oh my goodness, I got to put more on top, because they're doing it for you, and they're enriching as they go. So they're providing their own little amendments.
Well, and I think the other thing is that the mycorrhizae that we're starting to hear more about, which are these very fine fungal filaments.
Yes.
They have a symbiotic relationship with the tiny fibrous roots. And if we till too much or mix too much, we destroy those thread-like interconnections, and we don't want to do that.
And if we remove all the soil and replace it completely, those mycorrhizae aren't there.
That's right.
It takes a long time to grow back into the soil.
Yeah.
So in clay soils, I have another problem up here. Drainage problems are created when soil amendments are not incorporated with existing soil. So we're saying if somebody just puts completely new soil into our clay, there's a clay hole, it winds up being a bathtub
Yeah,
because the
or
clay doesn't drain, but it'll drain really fast through the amended soil and then stop at the clay layers. So then it's a bathtub.
well, yeah, and the other analogy that I like to use is if people do that, then the plant never realizes that it's in a garden. It still thinks it's in a pot. And so the roots just become not only will they dry out, but they also girdle themselves. They don't
Yeah,
venture out into the neighboring soil.
they circle. They
Yeah.
just circle and circle.
Mhm.
But in this bathtub effect, everything just rots because the one type of soil is just holding all the water. The water is not going through the clay. If you had put the clay soil back into the hole, the water would be draining through at the same rate all across the garden.
Yes. Well, in that instance, that's where it's really important just to top dress instead.
Yes. Excuse me. So when planting bare root roses, you need to soak the root in water for at least 24 hours. If the root has been shipped via the post or shipped on a truck, it will have tended to dry out. But don't soak it more than 48 hours. It's just going to start rotting. But it will absorb a lot of water in 24 hours soaking. Just soak the root. Don't soak the whole plant. The top doesn't want to be soaked. And it's going to give them time. Some of those filaments you were talking about, these big roots don't absorb the water. It's the little filaments that start growing out that start bringing in water from the surrounding soil. So as the plant itself will stay moist until the roots have time to start putting out those filamentous roots that will start absorbing the soil. So you don't want to put dry right in a new hole.
No, the one thing that I must say is that one piece of advice that I usually give, and it also helps you determine what the drainage is in your garden, is when you dig the hole, I always fill the hole up with water. And then as I'm getting my plant ready and maybe mixing a bit of compost into what I'm going to throw back in, then you can see how quickly it drains. And then you know that the water, a whole hole's worth of water, has soaked into the area that the roots are going to grow into. And then after you've backfilled, then water again. So I like to encourage everyone to do that.
And as they can see on this picture, at the point where the new canes are attached to the rootstock, or where the canes join the roots, is a slightly enlarged area called the bud union. And the Canadian Rose Society recommends in areas like mine that the cold winters are really cold, that graft, that bud union, be from 3 to 6 inches or 75 centimeters to 150 centimeters below the ground. So that's where you're talking about the pots having the bud union right on the soil level. It's got to go below ground. And they say up to 6 inches. You're almost planting it like a tulip.
Yeah, so
Because
people
we
often
plant our
when you
tulips that deep.
yes, and when you find a plant like this that's in a pot in the garden center that already has leaves and flowers, people are a bit squeamish about burying the canes with this foliage on them. But it's really important to have, 6 inches or 2 to 4 inches sometimes in a warmer zone, but to have that below the ground so that any die off above the soil level doesn't matter, because you've got the rose variety, the canes of the species that you have bought, protected, insulated in the soil.
And it will grow from that bud, from the base again.
Yes. And then the same kind of phenomenon is with some peonies that are also on grafted rootstock. So the deeper you have that bud union down, eventually the canes, in the case of roses, will start to grow some of their own roots.
Yes.
And so you're less likely to get suckers coming off the graft,
rootstock.
the rootstock.
Yes, because it's underground and doesn't get light.
Yes.
And you need to dig a hole larger than the width and deep enough to make sure that the bud union is below the soil level. So do tests when you're going to dig your hole. Don't just say, okay, that's how deep it has to be, and then just keep putting the plant into the hole to make sure that bud union is 6 inches below.
Now, the other thing that I was reading on a Northern Roses website was, if you can't dig down that deep, you know, depending on how your rootstock is growing, then try and find roses that have kind of a wonky shape, so that even though you put the bud root union down 6 inches, the roots can go off at an angle, and they'll eventually right themselves. But that way, you're putting the rootstock sort of horizontal, but the shoot itself is coming up vertical. So
yeah, so you'd want a tilted rose on the top.
Yeah.
The rose should be on an angle on the top, so you can. We did that.
Or you find where the graft is kind of at an angle.
Yeah, it's a good idea.
Strategy, because sometimes the subsoil is really dense, and what you can actually dig easily isn't that deep. So that's a way to get around it.
Okay, so once the hole's deep enough, you have to create a mound of soil for the bare root to sit on, if it's bare root. You just can't throw it in an open hole with no support. So take your time and place the rose in position where the mound needs to be, if necessary, and make a little upside down bowl of soil. Pat it down and place your rootstock on top of that. And remember, it has to be 3 to 6 inches deep. And the root should be solidly supported in the hole on top of that mound before filling in the hole with the rest of the soil. And once it's in the hole and covered with soil, you can prune off any damaged tips, because they're just going to die off anyway. And then soak it with a bucket of water or hose until all the air bubbles come to the surface, because air is the enemy of roots. Roots don't grow in air, they're meant to be in the soil. So you want to get all that air out, and by soaking it right after you plant it, even before you fill all the soil back in, soak it and then fill in the rest and soak it again. And once all the water is drained out, mound some soil to another mound over. It might seem strange, but mound some soil around the new plant to at least halfway its height and water it well, but don't water that soil away. And that's to keep the base of the canes moist in case you have drying winds, especially if you're planting later in the summer, in the early fall. It's protecting it just for a month, just to get it going. And for the next month, water the plant every 3 days, unless it's raining all the time, which it usually does in the fall. But you may still need to provide winter protection. But planting in this way will give you a rose a better chance of surviving the winter. You want to keep it alive. You want to keep it moist, especially if you have a lot of drying winds. Don't you agree, Karen?
Yes, and I would say that often bare root roses are shipped to have, in order to prevent the canes from desiccating, they're often coated in a wax, but this will sort of wear off as it rains and the sun shines.
Yes, the sun will melt it.
Does protect them somewhat from desiccation, but I like the idea of protecting them with that temporary mound.
Yeah, because it's going to wash away and flatten out.
Yeah.
But it's just to get, and it keeps it from wind rock. When you get high winds, the top could rock a little bit. It'll just hold it there until it starts getting some roots.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah.
And now we're talking about roses in pots. They're easy to plant. Plant your hole as deep as you need to, and we're talking about that bud union. It's probably just sitting on the top of the pot. So
well, yeah, it's actually, you can see the bud union on the yellow rose in the picture there. So that definitely is a clear demonstration that you don't go by the rule of planting at the pot soil depth. That rose, you're going to probably go, you're going to go at least 6 inches up those canes. So that bud union where that.
And that means it's almost going to be the top of the canes. And you're going to feel weird planting it that way, but that's what has to be done. And so you just have to make your hole to fit your plant plus the depth. You want that 6 inches over the bud union. And if you have a fiber pot, cut off the bottom at least. And because that fiber is hard for water to go through in the soil. It might dry it out. So just, if you've got a fiber pot, just cut it off. Obviously, if it's plastic, you're not planting the pot.
No, and I find with the fiber pots, you can, as long as you slit, like take the bottom off if you can and slit the sides, about 4 spots, you know.
Yeah,
like,
so if you've got roots growing through it already, you don't want to disturb them too much.
No. Yeah.
And so you just put the potted rose right in its hole and backfill, water, and mound the top again. Keep it moist if there's any top left, because in that one, by the time you get it 6 inches down, there won't be much top left.
No, like the tag, that yellow tag is probably about 4 inches. So basically, the yellow
almost
rose
the whole thing.
Yeah, you're going to be planting it almost to the tips of the canes. Yeah.
So if you're thinking about that in the store, get some longer canes if you can. And if you're planting hybrid teas and floribundas, placing them apart, you need to go about 18, 24 inches apart. Don't go squeezing plants together and then worry about their height and shape and width after. Put them in the correct position apart right from the beginning and infill with some annuals until the rose really starts to grow.
Yeah, I think
because mine is just huge and it starts invading, and then I have to start taking out other plants. Don't do that. Don't do my mistake.
Yeah, that's a very, very important point, and it's a mistake that many gardeners, even landscapers, make. Is it's hard to imagine a tiny, 6 by 6 inch by 6 inch plant becoming a 8 foot high and 6 foot wide shrub.
Yes.
So spacing is really important for airflow, and so that you're not pruning to fit the space. You plant to allow the plant to enjoy the space it needs. Yeah.
Yes, and shrub roses need a lot of space, so planting them at least 3 feet apart, and a lot more. And it depends on the height that they will reach at maturity. But a lot of times they grow bigger than what's advertised too, because if they're in a good position to begin with, they're not going to have die off.
No, and I think one mistake that people make more than others is planting too close to a fence or a building foundation. So if you imagine that most shrubs are going to become at least 3 feet by 3 feet, you should really be planting them at least 2 feet away from the base of a wall or a fence, unless you're going to espalier them.
Yes.
And so that's something that people don't think about.
Even looking at this climber, people want to plant them right against their building where they should be 3 feet out. They need root room. as well
Yes.
as
Yeah. Yeah.
height room. Need space for their roots to grow out. So on the old gardening shows, you'll see there's nothing against the wall except mulch, and everything is 3 feet away from and plus the wall dries out the soil faster.
Well, and the other thing is in many buildings, the overhang from a roof line is, 3 feet wide. So unless you have driving rain, um, there's quite a dry zone right next to a foundation. Um, and so
Very
that's,
dry.
yeah,
So you might wind up having to water instead of just letting the rain do its work.
that's right.
And climbing roses can be trained vertically, straight up, but the vines will usually only bloom at the top of the vine. So if you're going to plant a climbing rose, you should try and grow it either on an angle or horizontally so that a lot of shoots will come out from that horizontal cane, and that's what blooms.
Yeah,
Is
so
if
that's
you
when,
just put one straight up, it's not going to bloom along the sides.
yeah, I think we have a diagram coming up that shows that.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's easy if you've got a fence to grow it on or a trellis or something like that, but main cane produces the bloom at the tip. So by forcing it sideways, you're going to encourage side blooms because they always want to grow up. A climbing rose wants to grow up. And you can train them on an arbor by going horizontally.
Yeah, so that
Straightens.
diagram or the actual wrapping on the post really shows you that as it goes horizontally, temporarily, each side shoot that comes off it will be going up. And so then you're going to get many more blooms.
Yes, and that's what you want. The more blooms, the
Mhm.
better. And climbers in our climate. Tender climbers will not survive very cold winters and must be protected either by covering with soil once they're dormant, or by using a variety of soil or mulch coverings. And that's why we promote zone hardy varieties. They may still have some diebacks during hard winters, but they'll shoot up quickly on the surviving canes. We have here in town, I have been planting Finland, which is climbing rambling rose, excuse me. It's a rambling rose, but you train it up like a climber. And I mean, the tips can die off, but then it comes up from the side shoots and it blooms all at once, this white rose, but it is the national rose of Finland. It's the white rose of Finland. And it's tough as nails. And if I had choice between that or I don't want to be going to all this work. They actually dig a trench for the climbing rose, cover it with soil, then they cover it with
The boughs.
boughs, and forget it. It's still
Yeah,
going to
I've
freeze in our
actually
soil.
seen where they've trained it up a trellis. And so they've made their garden in a way where the entire trellis with the rose that's attached to it can be gently laid
Lower.
down without disturbing the roots too much on the ground, and then insulated and then
Yes.
brought back up later.
Straw,
Seems like a lot
burlap.
of work.
It's too much work for me in the fall. By the time the fall comes, like right now, I'm saying, okay, I'm ready for winter. I don't want to be doing too much work.
But that's why, if you are going to grow a climbing rose, then you think about the wind exposure and sun scald exposure in the winter, and sort of strategically place your climber where it's more sheltered.
Mm-hmm.
And then, it'll just have more protection from the little microclimate that you have.
Mm-hmm. And if you're growing hybrid tea roses, floribundas, or grandifloras, you need extra protection as well. The Toronto Master Gardeners stayed on their website, cut back hybrid tea, Floribunda, and grandiflora roses to about 18 inches to avoid wind damage and possible upheaval of roots in strong winds.
Yeah,
So
because if
you
you
must get a
imagine
lot
a
of
wind,
winter wind.
yeah, and if you have, well, especially in a city, for example, you get a lot of wind tunnels. But if you think if there's really heavy wind on something, it's going to be shaking those canes around, which will, that energy translates down to the soil and it'll shake the roots around.
Yeah.
So that's one reason that you prune roses after, when they're sort of dormant in the late fall, so that they're not too tall. They won't whip around in the wind.
Yes. And after the ground's frozen, we're going to do the same thing, hill up some soil to cover the ground, the crown. Don't use the soil from around the root. Get some soil from another part of the garden. Hill it up to cover the crown where the graft is located. Well, the graft's underground, but around the base of the rose, which will protect it some more, because we could have in the winter die back to soil level.
Yes.
So if we have that mound, everything under the ground will survive.
And I think that's
May die.
why, there's a lot more stress nowadays of making sure that graft union, when you have a grafted rose, which will be your hybrid teas, grandifloras, floribundas, make sure that graft is, quite deep, 6 inches. And so then the soil hill that you make isn't as crucial. But you can make you can make a cage with chicken wire, for example, and then fill that with fall leaves, and sort of insulate it that way. You just have to.
Don't use manure or compost, because they give off heat.
Yes.
You want it to freeze. You don't want
Yes.
something that's going to give off heat.
Yeah. So sort of a loose fill of fall leaves that won't get matted and wet, because then you're also going to be encouraging rotting. So you want to have sort of frozen but good airflow in there.
And then pruning roses. Oh, pruning roses can be a scary subject. People just shudder at the thought of pruning roses. But a rose is no different than any other shrub when it comes to pruning. Dead and diseased wood, which prevents the spread of disease to the rest of the bush and opens up the center to air and light. Roses need air circulation for general plant health, and it's necessary for plant respiration. If you can imagine, the leaves need to be able to breathe, they need that air going through, and helps prevent diseases that grow in stale, humid environments. It is necessary for photosynthesis. The only necessary piece of equipment is a pair of bypass pruners, which work exactly like a pair of scissors. The blades pass each other by, and a pair of gloves so you don't get poked by any prickles.
Yeah, they're quite nasty scratches otherwise.
Well, if you have hands like mine, I do it just plain. I don't even wear gloves. Pruning is best done in the spring, just before the buds open. And learn how to cut a branch, and you will avoid a lot of the disease problems before they start. Anyone that has admired a garden rose knows that many of them have sharp prickles on the stems, so you need to wear those gloves, not like me, but I got tough hands. Protect your hands from cuts, because those cuts last a long time. They burn.
Yeah, and I think heavy leather gloves is the key.
Yeah, not your winter fluffy gloves. You need leather. First, you need to be able to find an outward facing bud, as shown here.
See, and that, just to emphasize the outward facing aspect. So if you imagine sort of the shape of a vase, and this is true for any shrub pruning, is you want to have good airflow through the center. So you're always looking for where the growth
To
is.
open the center.
Yeah, so you want the growth to grow out, sort of the circumference will get slightly wider. Yeah.
Can you keep talking for a minute, Karen? I have to run for an emergency.
Sure. Yeah. So this, I can't change the slides, but we'll just talk about pruning. So pruning any shrub, people are afraid of pruning any kind of shrub. So I do a lot of gardening for people where I'm renovating their gardens that have overgrown and people are terrified of cutting. And if you realize that cutting, if you do it well and don't overwhelm the plant, so you don't want to ever cut off more than about a third of the active growing areas, you're actually stimulating branching. And so this is also applies if you've got an early and infested shrub with aphids and things that love the new succulent growth. You can actually prune off some of the new growth to a lower down outward facing bud and, you know, drown all those nasty little insects that are sucking the life out of your plant. The life cycle is stopped. They're not going to breed and create more aphids or whatever the insect is. But, you know, especially if it's a reblooming rose, you're just going to get a delayed regrowth, but you've beat the life cycle of the insect. Anyway, just think about when you prune slightly above, see that little bud to the left? That's where the new bud is starting to swell, and that is a potential new branch. So when you cut above a little bud, often they lay dormant waiting. So in nature, they would have been waiting for the branches to get nibbled by a grazing animal or broken off by the wind, and then they're ready to sprout a new branch. So basically, if you cut about a centimeter above an outward facing bud or the direction that you want your plant to grow. So if you're pruning, say, a shrub that's against a wall or a fence, the outward facing buds would not be around the entire shrub. They would be sort of facing out in the three directions away from the wall. And if you do it at a slight angle, it just allows the rain to drip off rather than settling, so that prevents rot, and also the sap that's coming out of the plant will also drip
Sorry
down.
about
So
that, Karen.
yeah, that's the
I'm
only
back.
reason that you do an angle cut is for moisture flow. Yeah, so here's
So
a
we have
good
some examples here.
yeah, so here's a good example. So you want to grow about a centimeter above an outward facing bud. If you cut too high, like the example on the left, or even if you're a little bit more wary and cut too high, what you encourage is sort of witch's broom growth at the end rather than forcing the new growth from the bud, or you get a more extended piece of dying tissue, which is an invitation for disease. If you cut too low, then you're encroaching in, you're sort of interfering with the circulatory system that's going to nourish that bud. So you want to do it like the one on the far right, where it's about a centimeter above that bud, a slight angle to allow rainwater and sap to drip down, but not too much of an angle that it hasn't interfered with the circulatory system of the tree that's nourishing that new bud.
That's great. Sorry for having to run. I take care of my elderly mother and I had to yell. So that's why I do webinars online. Okay, and now that you know how to make a cut, what part of the bush should you cut and where? Pruning old garden roses is rather easy. Don't if you can help it. These once blooming will only bloom off of year-old wood. So it means that they are growing their wood right now for next year's rose bloom. So you don't want to be cutting the next year's blooms off. So avoid heavy pruning other than removing dead or diseased growth. And that can be done any time of the year, especially if you're starting to get disease on a plant. Get rid of it right away instead of letting it spread more to the plant.
Yeah, I
And
like to think about the 3Ds.
what are the 3Ds?
Like diseased, damaged, dying. So those you can prune off anytime that you notice them. Yeah.
And outside of removing dead and diseased growth, pruning back a cane 1/3. Rule of thumb if you have to for the winter to avoid damage, but for winter damage, but roses, these old ones, they don't need much pruning. But the new garden roses should, new old garden roses, the ones you've just planted, shouldn't be pruned in the first 2 years. It gives them time to produce strong supporting canes, and just give them time. Don't think that everything has to be pruned all the time. If something dies back in the winter, you're going to cut back that dying growth in the spring anyway.
That's right.
Most of our hybrid roses prune in the spring just as the buds start showing, so you can see where the buds are in the spring to stimulate growth, because pruning stimulates growth.
Yeah, the other thing that I was mention is if you're not sure, you just think about when that shrub, the rose or any other shrub, blooms. So if they only bloom once, you're always going to prune shortly after they've finished blooming. If they continue to bloom, which means they're growing, they're producing buds mostly on new growth, then you can prune in the spring. You might be cutting off, some are a combination, so you might be cutting off some buds that overwintered, but you won't be sacrificing any of the later blooms because they will be making those buds in the growing season. So if you just think about when they bloom, that's a really good way to know when to prune.
And this just shows the urn shape you were talking about, that when you do prune, if you're pruning those hybrid roses that you need to really prune more hard, you want to get that urn shape to, that's what you're trying to get in the end when you're getting the outward facing rose buds, so that they grow out from the plant and let the air and the light into the plant.
Yeah, so that's a good a good picture. You're just sort of thinning out the inside in particular.
Yes, and taking out the weak canes in the center. There are some weak canes on the left-hand side picture, that coming right out from the base, or any suckers that may be trying to grow right from the root system that are not the same rose. And you're just trying to increase your airflow and get light and air in, and take out any damaged and diseased wood. And the height's determined by the rose. If you're cutting back the hybrid roses and you want the finished roses, the fully grown rose for that year to be knee height, you have to cut back. But if you want your roses to be waist height, you're going to be pruning back to knee height. Is that correct?
Yeah, or in general, you just think, I mean, you can prune shrubs hard to keep them small, but in general, you want to look at the size that they want to become. And like Pam mentioned earlier, you don't really want to cut off more than 1/3 of the plant. So yeah.
But you also don't want to wind up with a rose that the blooms are over your head and you can't enjoy.
That's true. Yeah.
Unless it's a shrub rose or climbing rose.
Well, mostly the tall ones are the climbing roses. Yeah.
Yes. And once blooming climbing roses and ramblers only bloom off the year-old wood. You explained that after blooming season, and it stimulates new growth for the blooms next year. And you already discussed the rest of the things. So major pests and diseases. Let's look at what grows on roses. Oops, hang on. So the best way to keep pests and disease away is to have that healthy plant and a genetically disease-resistant plant. Other than that, let's take a look at your plant on a regular basis and deal with the outbreaks before they get out of control. I must also state that some gardeners, including myself, let nature take its course. Pests that attack roses also have predators. So if you have a garden with a mixed selection of plants, there will be wasps and beetles, birds and spiders that will either eat or lay eggs on the pests you want to get rid of. So instead of spraying a plant and killing the whole system and the whole cycle of pests and predators, I let nature take its course.
Yeah, that's really important because a lot of chemical control methods that we have are not species specific. So they kind of are broad spectrum killer. And so we kill all the good stuff too, which we don't want to do.
And the butterflies that come to, and the bumblebees. And tent caterpillars. I have to talk about this one because this is one of the big ones this year. We have tent caterpillars on everything, including my roses. And during the spring, every morning I'd go outside, look at the tips of the rose bushes. They want to be on the tips, and pick off any caterpillars by hand. There are no caterpillars on my roses anymore. They munching on everything else in the garden. But the sparrows are munching on the caterpillars. I was surprised to see the sparrows going and picking off the caterpillars off of everything their year. And they're feeding their babies. And they're fat, those tent caterpillars. Such is the cycle of life, and I'm happy to be sharing my garden with the wildlife.
Now, it was interesting because tent caterpillars are not a pest that sort of more southern gardeners usually associate with roses. So I was interested to find in my readings that it is a phenomenon that is more common up north for roses.
Yes.
We see it down here on certain tree species, but not roses. So that's interesting.
And they only go for the tips. So don't ask me how they walk up all the prickles to get to the tips, but they make it there. So
I guess it's in general that pests in general, they love sort of lush, new, tender growth. So tips are usually where you find most pests.
Yes. Aphids. Now, I actually don't have many aphids on my roses because I'm growing the hardiest roses in the world. So they are usually disease resistant, these older roses. So, but if you have aphids, you need to check them regularly for an infestation. And like you said, they like the tips. And you need to look for green or pink aphids. Am I correct? Clustering on the bud shoots?
Yeah, I think that's the type that you normally find on roses. So, you know, it's important if you've spread your rose plants apart, then aphids normally don't fly. They're usually crawling insects. They move fairly slowly. So if you've got one rose bush infested, if the others are quite far from it, they're not likely to spread. And the aphids that are on your rose are not going to go on your other neighboring plants unless they happen to be in the rose family. So that's something to understand, is that the aphids that are on your rose of Sharon are not the ones that are on your burning bush, are not the ones that are on your rose. They all have different particular aphids.
Species specific.
Yes.
And if you do have aphids, you probably have a sticky honeydew. And then you probably have ants that are picking up that sticky honeydew. And with all this sticky honeydew, you can get black sooty molds.
Yeah, so that to me is when it becomes dangerous for your plant. Is once you've got the black sooty mold, if there's enough of it, it blocks the chlorophyll production. The sunlight can't get to the leaves. And so that's when they start to really do badly. The actual, if the aphid infestation is just on the tips, you're going to sacrifice your blooms, but not your entire plant. But once you've got the sooty mold, that's when it becomes a big problem. So that's why, you know, if you have to help get rid of the aphids and not just let the ladybugs do their job, that would be why.
Mm-hmm. And before you run out and try and buy a spray for your aphids, blooming roses should not be sprayed with any pesticide while in bloom because you could hurt the pollinating insects such as bees, butterflies, and other insects. And if it is in bloom, try spraying your bush with a blast of water or squish some of your aphid colony with your fingers. If you're squeamish, wear gloves.
Yeah, I actually like to do that, go around and squish it. It's very satisfying.
If you have a mixed border, you'll encourage a wide variety of insects into your garden and use mulch because a lot of people don't think about mulch as a place where insects that eat aphids can hide. And a wide variety of flowering plants will invite flying insects that feed on aphids. Insects in your garden, the greater chance that some of them will be eating your aphids.
Yeah,
so that it won't get out of control.
Yeah, so just thinking of aphids, like we always think of ladybugs eating aphids. We've been taught that a lot. And the important thing to realize is people know the life cycle of the ladybugs because often people have mistaken the ladybug grubs, which also feed voraciously on aphids. They don't they get rid of those grubs because they think those grubs are eating the plant. So make sure you know what a ladybug larva looks
Yes, they look like a little black spiky caterpillar, and you think they're eating my plants, but they're actually eating the other bugs.
But the other thing is lacewings, which is a common insect to the garden, has these kind of transparent wings. So they're one of the predatory insects. And then a lot of wasps. So a lot of people are afraid of wasps, but they don't realize that many wasps are parasitic, and so they're hunters. And so they will also be going after the aphids. So don't go
The only wasps.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, don't go about
the only wasps you want the good ones. The only wasps you really have to worry about are the hornets in the fall, and they're the aggressive ones. But I mean, they're the ones with the big nests. There's a lot of solitary wasps that never go into colonies. They just burrow holes in the soil and plant their eggs, and they're never a whole colony. So treat your wasps like you do your bumblebees and enjoy them and feed them, and a lot of those things will be eating your aphids.
Yes.
What do you think about any insecticidal? A lot of people are into using insecticidal soaps.
I think insecticidal soaps can be okay. I mean, definitely they will work on aphids because aphids aren't moving around. And the way insecticidal soaps work, as well as horticultural oils, is they create a film that basically suffocates the insect. But you know, if you're going to spray a plant that also has a lot of ladybugs going after those aphids, then the insecticidal soap or the horticultural oil will also kill those beneficial insects. So I would always try that. Yeah, I would always try the hand squishing and the water blasting first, and then only go after some very selected areas with the other methods.
Yeah. And water blasting works because they don't fly.
No. There is one phase in their life cycle where the females will fly, but in general, they don't.
The ones that are killing your plant aren't.
Yeah.
Okay, the dreaded powdery mildew. It's one of the commonest disease of foliage, and it disfigures a bush and reduces the strength of the plant. And we don't want to reduce the strength of our plant. Look for a white, powdery fungal growth on the leaves and shoots, and upper or lower or both leaf surfaces can be affected. It can turn the leaves yellow, reddish, or purple, and the affected parts of the leaf and heavily infected young leaves can be curled and distorted.
And I find like this, Yeah, I was just going to mention that this is one that you see in the later
Stage.
stages, because it really thrives in warm, hot, dry weather. But then when you have cool nights, so you tend to find powdery mildew not at the beginning of the growing season, but sort of mid to late growing season.
And the flower buds, if they're infected, they'll fail to open properly.
Yeah. So
Mildew growth on, go ahead.
I was going to say, this is why it's really important to prune for airflow, and you're less likely to get powdery mildew if you've got good airflow.
And mildew growth on stems, where it's often found surrounding the thorns and flower stalks, is usually thicker and more mat-like than the growth on the leaves. But that means it's at a really bad stage if it's that thick. And preventing mildew, what do you suggest?
Well, if it's really bad, then, and sort of opening up the airflow hasn't worked, then, you can, if you know you've got an infestation and then the spores are actually going to stick around into the next year and beyond. So that's when you need to get out your lime sulfur that you can buy on its own or in dormant oil kits, and you need to spray it when they're dormant with that. And then you can also use the fungicidal soap. So you have and you can use wettable sulfur in the growing season. But you just got to make sure anytime you coat something, you're also inhibiting photosynthesis and the sort of the energy manufacture of the plant. So a lot of times you leave this thing on for a while, and then you wash them off. Because if you think of soaps having a film, sticky, they're also going to be clogging the pores where the plant is respiring. So that's why you have to wash those off. Not leave them on too long.
And black spot.
So
black spots, go ahead.
I was going to say, this has been a particularly bad one around here because we had so much spring rain and cool weather, and it thrives in cooler, moist weather, which is often in the spring and perhaps in the fall.
And just keeping the plant generally healthy by fertilizing and keeping an eye on everything. I guess it is worse if the plant is less vigorous, correct?
Yes, I would say, like, we don't think of plants as having immune systems, but they do. So whenever they're stressed by, unusually cold weather, too much water, or drought, too hot, whenever they're stressed, then they're more vulnerable to fungal diseases. They're more vulnerable to insect infestations. They can actually fight off insect infestations. A lot of plants use their own chemical warfare, but if they're overwhelmed, they just can't keep up. So the more we sort of provide a healthy environment for our plants, the more they can look after themselves.
Good. We want healthy plants. Thrips. Thrips are brownish yellow winged insects that prefer lighter colored flowers, and I'm surprised at that. They lay eggs in a small slit of the new growth while the larvae sucks out plant fluids. And thrips, the petal edges may look brown or discolored, and some of the buds will only partially open and then probably wither and die. So do you have many thrips down where you are?
You tend to see it more in some of the hybrid roses that are more susceptible. They lose some of their disease resistance when people are breeding for sort of lush flower color and shape. And they're hard to, thrips are really difficult to see unless they're on a light colored petals, like the white shows up. If darker colored roses, like dark reds, you wouldn't see them the same. Now with thrips, one of the best ways to control them if you don't have a lot of natural predators like lacewings and ladybugs is because they overwinter, the adults pupate in the soil, and so
Mm-hmm.
you can do like a dormant oil soak in the spring and around the base of the plant, and that will inhibit the adults from emerging. The only thing you've got to think about is some of the beneficial insects are also overwintering.
Yes.
So if you do the soak, the dormant oil soak, you're also going to suffocate a lot of the good insects.
Yes. They get the good with the bad.
Yeah.
There's the rose midge, which I'm not that familiar with, but it's a damaging pest of roses. The tiny midge has a very fast life cycle and is hard to control. Its eggs are laid at the base of a bud, and a tiny maggot emerges, and it sucks out sap from the buds, which turn brown, shrivel, and disintegrate. And early signs of an attack may be that the buds don't open properly.
Yeah, so that's why I would say, like, you see you've got a rose and it's got tons of buds and they're getting infested by something. Some of these things are pretty tiny. It's hard to tell exactly what they are sometimes. But especially if you've got a blooming rose variety, the best thing to do then is to prune out all those new buds that are not thriving. Sort of seems drastic. Make sure you drop that into some soapy or oily water. So you're going to suffocate all those bugs, and especially with midges that have many life cycles in a growing season, you're going to stop that continuation. And very soon after you've pruned, you're going to have new buds growing. But in the meantime, you've stopped the chance of any adults surviving, laying eggs, and continuing on their cycle. So I find pruning off infested tips is one of the best strategies.
That's good. Well, at least there's some strategy for that. Rose slugs, and I don't think I've ever seen rose slugs up here, but they're the larvae of a sawfly. There's several sawfly species that feed on roses, and then the most common one is the light green larvae with orangey heads, like shown here. And the young larvae turn rose leaves to skeletons, and leaving a clear layer of tissue that eventually turns brown.
Now these...
And older larvae look like caterpillars and take big bites out of the leaves.
Yeah, so I think they're probably affected by your really cold winters, so that the adults or the pupa aren't surviving the winter. So one of the best ways of controlling them, because these are a larger insect that you can actually see it, and it's easy to pick up. So the best thing to do is hand pick them. There's many types of sawflies, so you often see them on species like pines. You can also do the spraying with horticultural insecticidal soaps because they don't move very fast, so you can actually, kill them that way. But hand picking is one of the easiest.
Or lots of birds. Lots of birds.
Yeah, and it's a flying insect. The adult is a flying insect that lays the eggs.
Yes. So there's nothing we can do about the flying ones, but the ones that are eating your rose, you can pick. Now, the pesticide ban. Do you want us to talk about the pesticide ban?
Well, just that it's been in place since 2009, and they keep sort of amending it slightly, bringing things back in and taking certain things out. So you can go on to the OMAFRA website and find out more details. So varieties of spray bottles that you've found in the garden center, you got to be aware you could be breaking the law if you've kept some around for a long time, and they might not be allowed any longer. And the main reason that a lot of these things were banned was they found that homeowners weren't using them responsibly, not doing their research into the life cycle of the pests and diseases, and using them at the most critical times. And so, as we've talked about already, is a lot of these things are broad spectrum. So then we are impacting on the environment, the ecosystem as a whole, and destroying a lot of the beneficial insects. So we don't want to do that.
Yes. And people can go to the Government of Ontario and look up pesticides, and they have all the information on the pesticide ban and what pesticides are allowed. And you can no longer go to the store and buy those pesticides you used to be able to buy.
No, and that, I mean, there's a lot of good things out there now because they've done, trial and error, found some good things that work that aren't as harmful as some of the old stuff.
Yes. And planting the right plant in the right place and varieties hardy to your zone on the correct rootstock, the Rosa multiflora, and in full sun is the best way to keep pests and diseases off your roses. Watering. When do you water? Get rid of that handheld nozzle you've got on the end of your hose. Put out a sprinkler, or my grandfather used to put a sock on the end of the hose to disperse the water on the ground instead of spraying it on the foliage. And soak your rose weekly or more often if the weather is dry. How often do you have to water your roses, Karen?
In general, I'm a low water gardener. I like to use mulch, especially in a new garden before you've got the size of the plant shading the soil. I find mulch helps the soil keep cool and it conserves moisture. I like to use soaker hoses. So you mostly want to try and water.
People be surprised how long it takes to get water to the bottom of the rose roots. It takes a lot of soaking.
Yeah, so in general, I always tell people to, instead of watering a little bit every day, which is what will happen if you use, one watering can or one bucket, is people should water for like a good hour or use a water rain gauge. So you want to make sure that once a week, either through rain or through your own irrigation, that you're putting down about an inch of water. And basically you want to be soaking water down a good foot into your soil. And that way you know that it's reaching the roots at the bottom. You're encouraging deep root growth. If you water frequently and shallowly, then the roots will just stay at the surface, and then they're very vulnerable to summer drought. So you want to encourage them to go down deeper, and you won't have as many vulnerable roots at the surface.
Yes, that'll freeze thaw cycle too.
Yeah.
And prune to increase light and air circulation.
Yeah, so we've talked about this a lot, and really that's all you're doing. Let the plants sort of grow in their natural form, and you're really pruning to get rid of diseased, damaged, dying, and in general just to open up the canopy and encourage growth in the direction that you want it to go.
And clean up any of that infected foliage you prune off. Don't put them back in your garden. Don't put them in your compost. Throw them in the garbage, right?
Yes. Now, the other thing that I would say about just thinking about infection like the fungal diseases, when you have a mulch, so it could be a living mulch like companion plants that are growing, low-growing companion plants underneath. Like some companion plants that are good for roses are alliums, nasturtiums, alyssum, geraniums, and some of the herbs like rosemary, thyme. So thyme, there's a lot of creeping thymes, great companion for roses. So if the bare soil is covered by something, the spores that are in the soil are not going to get splashed up onto the rose foliage when there's a rain or when you're using a sprinkler. So if you think about where the disease or the pest come from, it helps you with your strategy.
Great. And we haven't mentioned fertilizing yet, but roses are a flowering shrub. So by using a standard flower fertilizer, it'll help keep the rose bush healthy, which will keep it resistant to pest and disease. And what they say is do not use chemical fertilizer for potted roses. Can you talk about some of the amendments such as compost, manure, bone meal, things like that?
Yeah, so in general, like plants really don't differentiate between a chemical fertilizer. Most fertilizers are concentrating on the three main nutrients: nitrogen, which is what's in manure; phosphorus, which is in the
Bone.
bone meal; and potassium, which is often in the blood meal. And there's also lots of nitrogen in blood meal. Those are the three main ingredients. So the plant doesn't care if it's sort of organic amendment added or if it's chemical. But what does make a difference is the ecosystem in the soil. If you're trying to encourage worms and beetles and mycorrhizae from the fungal threads, other sort of swimming insects and things that are the ecosystem, the creatures, the organisms that create the slime that help the soil clump together and create better air and water channels. When you use chemical fertilizers, it tends to inhibit that ecosystem in the soil.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of, to me, you have to use a combination. Like often when you're trying to encourage repeat blooming, people like to use the chemical fertilizers, but there are organic ones. Like there's alfalfa meal, kelp meal, there's fish meal that you can add. If you don't want to encourage,
Because
sorry, I was just going to say about any fertilizer that's too high in nitrogen is going to encourage really lush growth. That's what a lot of the sucking insects like aphids go after. So you want your fertilizer to be balanced. When you're promoting roots and flowering, then you usually want the middle number, the phosphorus, and often the last number, the potassium, to be higher than the first number, which is the nitrogen.
yes, and I was just going to mention that you're not actually fertilizing the plant, you're fertilizing the soil.
Yeah, so then it's taking up.
You're adding it to the soil.
Yeah, so then it's taking it up through the root zone, and and so if you have healthy soil, then the roots are going to have more access. It's going to be. It also depends on how the soil binds those nutrients. If they release them to the roots.
pH.
Yeah.
pH. So we'll go on to the next one. Mulching. So roses like their roots cool and their tops in sun. So by using mulch, we conserve moisture, weed growth. Who wants to do any weeding? I always use more mulch and more mulch. But do you agree that you do not put the mulch right up against the rose canes?
No, so in general, when you're mulching in your garden, you want to leave, an inch or so away from the base of your tree, the base of your shrub stems, your perennial stems, definitely your rose canes, because it traps the moisture, too much moisture, and you can get rot and more fungal diseases. The other reason why mulch works for suppressing weeds is most weed seeds that get stirred up in the soil, brought to the surface, they can stay there dormant for sometimes up to 20 years, waiting for the right germination conditions. So if we cover with mulch, the sunlight and the temperature can't get to the seeds, and so they don't germinate. Then any weed seeds that fall into the mulch, it's a much looser composition than the more dense soil beneath. So if they do take root in the mulch, they're easier to pull out.
Yes, so they're very easy to pull out.
Yeah. And then the other thing, as the mulch we were saying, is that it also helps roses if there are sort of black spot and the mildew diseases in the area. So they get blown on the wind, they overwinter in the soil. So the mulch also protects the foliage from water splashing up. So that's another reason why mulch is good.
And if you have no choice but to spray, use a biopesticide, which is one of the products that have live organisms in them, but they can be sensitive to environmental conditions such as sun, rain, humidity, temperature, and beneficial nematodes are also live organisms. And so you really have to follow instructions on the bottles if you spray. You can't
Well,
go back to the old way of just, here's a spray, let's just go spray.
well, and also when you're using biopesticides, like the nematodes, for example, or if you're using the bacterial BT, they're attacking the pests at a certain stage in their life cycle. So it's really important that you put them down at the right time. If you put them on when that life cycle is not happening with your pest, then they're not going to do anything. So
you wasted your money again.
Yeah.
And questions. Now, we're not live this time, but people can still ask us questions. In Northeastern Ontario, you can ask a question on the Facebook page, Cochrane District Master Gardeners. You can also send me, Pamela Dallaire, an email at pameladallaire@hotmail.com. Also, for the areas in more southern Ontario, contact the Master Gardeners of Ontario Incorporated at mgoi.ca, and you'll also find information on how to become a Master Gardener. And I will have the chat box underneath this video open, and I'll check on it occasionally. So if you do have a question, you can type it underneath this video. And like I said before, we will put the links that we discussed during the webinar underneath in the YouTube description for everyone to be able to access those websites. And on behalf of my co-host Karen Sciuk and myself, I'd like to thank you for joining today's webinar on growing roses in Northern Ontario. And more webinars are scheduled for the months ahead, so keep watching and have a great day. And thank you, Karen, so much for helping me today.
Yes, it was a pleasure, and happy gardening, everyone.
Thank you very much.